and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bauer. So I suppose at the beginning of this one I should announce the location of the last one, just in case anybody guessed, and maybe guessed the right one. The last one was on Black Sage Road, looking west at the very bottom of the landfill road. If you can place that in your location in your mind. Okay, today's reading is chapter 37 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. And in chapter 37, Fran's optimism is barely rewarded. Just a minute here. Yeah, there's some go-karts or something over there. Seems like no matter where I go, I'm going to run into some traffic. But as subscriber Laird pointed out, it's never very intrusive. Fran and Elgin visit a school to reassure the children. Remember, they're destroying, breaking down, dismantling Green Comet. The children can't wait to get into a smasher and get to work. And they're thrilled that it will be Buzzard who will be showing them how. The people start to go down in order for deep hibernation, because almost everybody is going to be in deep hibernation for the next while they try to deal with the pending arrival of the scout sent by the visitor.
Chapter 37, Separation. Fran was right to be optimistic, though just barely. The people voted for her plan by a simple majority of 53%. The ratio was higher amongst the children, at over 60%. People speculated whether it was simple devotion to Francis, or if children might fear for their lives more than they love their possessions. Elgin asked them that very question when he and Fran visited the school to explain things to the children. By the time they got there, a few days after the vote, a much higher majority of them were agreed that this was the best course of action. Why, he asked them. Was it Francis? The children answered the way a group of children does, tossing it around from one to the next, looking at each other, coming to a consensus. Finally, one of the natural leaders took it and tried to summarize it. He said, "We figured it was better to do something." While the others said yeah and made other sounds of agreement, Elgin said that was it. It felt better to do something rather than nothing. "Yes," said the boy, and they all looked at Elgin as if it was obvious. "Okay," said Elgin, "thank you for answering that. Now, do you know why Fran and I are here today?" "You're going to explain why we have to destroy the school?" That was a bit unadorned for Elgin, but he said yes. He looked them over, then said, "I think you know already, don't you?" They nodded, so he asked, "Do you have any questions then?" The spokesperson said yes. "Do we get to help?" They held their breath until Elgin said, "Of course." Then there was a flurry of little voices who all wanted to be the first to use Elgin's mechanical man. Fran laughed, and Elgin couldn't help but smile. "Well," he said, "I'll talk to some people. We'll have to see if it's all right," he added over their cheering. "But if there are no objections, then all we have to do is find the time." "I can't wait to smash my desk," said one child. "Me too," said another. Elgin had to interrupt. "We won't be using it here," he said. To their quizzical faces he explained, "There's not enough room in here. You know how big that thing is. Can you imagine swinging its hammer in here?" Trying to imagine it put them in fits of laughter. "No, we'll have to do it someplace where it's more open, like the corridors or the square." That was all right with them. "I'm going to smash the columns," one said, and it began a competition for the most spectacular smash. "Besides," said Elgin, "in an open space like that, you can walk around." More laughter as they imitated the big stick man walking. Slower, said Elgin. Its movements have to be slower because of inertia. A little more play acting, then the spokesperson asked, Are we really going to smash everything? F.A., said Elgin. Some stuff we're going to hide, like valuable equipment and resources. But we can't hide everything, so we have to try to make it look natural. He noted their concerned expressions. Don't worry, he said. We'll rebuild it when we get up again. Can we help rebuild it? Do you want to? Yeah, they shouted in unison. Then you can help me rebuild it, said Elgin. I'm an engineer, so I'll be involved for sure. You're an engineer? Yes, I work with Stanton and Buzzard. You work with Buzzard? The children were impressed. Buzzard, the flashball player? Elgin and Fran smiled at each other. Yes, I do. And I play flashball with him, too. We're both on the Harriers. You're on Buzzard's team? They had liked Elgin well enough before. Now they were in awe of him. You like Buzzard a lot, don't you? Yeah. Well, maybe I could get him to come along. That is, if I can get hold of the Smasher. They cheered excitedly. The children got their wishes, both of them. Elgin was able to get the Smasher, everyone was calling it that now, for a full week for the exclusive use of school children. In part, it was a kind of reward for the good job they'd done breaking up their schoolrooms. They followed instructions perfectly. They left no right angle intact, nothing that looked the least bit artificial. They'd been told that the visitor used radar with a frequency of 40 gigahertz, which gave it a wavelength of about 3/4 of a centimeter. They were intent on breaking everything down smaller than that, until they were told that it might make the visitors suspicious. They did a good job, and they were thrilled to be allowed to use the Smasher. Even more exciting than that was the fact that it would be Buzzard teaching them. Elgin and Francis watched from their balcony as, bright and early on the first day, Buzzard walked the Smasher into the square to the wild cheering of a big pack of children. He demonstrated for them for a while, walking and moving his arms, so they could get a good idea of what he was doing. Somehow, even in a rigid arthropodic machine, he still managed to move with a hint of his characteristic fluidity. Fran pointed it out, and they both had to shrug. It wasn't something you could explain, it was just Buzzard. The real fun began when the children took their turns. The order was established by a lottery, so they all knew when their turn was and there was no jostling for position. It started with each one getting a 5-minute familiarization session. That would be enough to learn how to move in it, but that's all. It would leave enough time for 2 more stints, so they could do something effective in their allotted time, and not feel as though they wasted it all learning. It also took advantage of the brain's ability to integrate a new skill between practicing it. Watching the antics of a big machine, the 2 watchers couldn't help thinking about that other one, the von Neumann machine that they were calling the Visitor. This machine, the Smasher, had no independent volition. It required an operator before it could do anything. That led Elgin to wonder if there was any sentient intelligence motivating the Visitor. I don't think so, said Fran. I could be wrong, of course. It might be controlled by organic beings. She shook her head. It doesn't feel like it, though. What you say sounds right to me, said Elgin. It never once tried to communicate with us, said Fran. And those images, it doesn't look as if there's any provision for life support there. That was true. The pictures showed machines of stark utilitarian efficiency, with no concession to the frailty of organic beings. The Smasher, on the other hand, was obviously built to work around its operator. It was nothing like the Visitor, and Elgin had to admit again that they weren't going to find any comforting familiarity in the truly alien invader. That made him feel cold and isolated, and exposed. A chill penetrated to the center of him, and he felt vulnerable for the first time. "Granny," he said, "do you think we'll make it?" "I don't know," she said. "Can't you tell?" "No." They watched Buzzard and the children, marveling at his way with them. Each one took their turn in an orderly fashion, paid attention, and learned what he was showing them, and finished, grinning happily. Stanton, who'd accompanied Buzzard as an extra set of eyes, didn't have to do anything. They didn't know it, but he was doing more than they realized by just being there. If it had been Buzzard alone, then the fun and giddiness might have spun out of control, but Stanton's presence kept a governor on it. It wasn't just that the children felt constrained under his eye, it was about Buzzard, too. They felt that he was more like them than he was like a grown-up, and they sensed that Stanton was his grown-up. They kept themselves under control because they didn't want to get Buzzard in trouble. Fran and Elgin saw Maria climb into the smasher, and they sat up to pay attention. She made some experimental movements, then she turned and walked across the floor and up the orange wall, Buzzard flying along beside her. She started across the ceiling, then stopped part way. Buzzard stopped too, ready for whatever she might choose to do next. So when she extended one of the machine's arms and opened its hand, he got it right away and climbed into it. With him standing on her palm, she walked the rest of the way across the ceiling, down the green wall, and back to her starting point. There she allowed Buzzard to disembark, turned to face her spectators, and made a low, sweeping bow to a warm round of applause. Elgin looked at Fran and saw that she was smiling happily. Two people she cared for, that she had a special protective feeling for, had just shared a memorable moment. She was greatly enjoying it, and that made Elgin feel good. "Sometimes," he said, "something happens that just makes you glad to be alive." "Yes," she said, blinking away tears. "Now I really hope the visitor is rational." "Oh?" "Yes. If it's rational, then it won't pursue us beyond reason." Her voice grew distant. "If it's rational, then all it wants to do is claim the resources in the system, and it won't go out of its way out here, where resources are poor and thinly distributed." "I see what you mean," said Elgin. "Here's hoping that whoever created the visitor programmed its artificial intelligence to be rational." He added, "even if they couldn't prevent it from going insane." The people who voted against Fran's plan were given the option of going down first. It seemed only reasonable that the ones who voted in favor should be prepared to do the majority of the work, and to be last in line for hibernation. That was somewhat how it went, but a large percentage felt the pull of duty in spite of having voted against it. As the numbers dwindled, as living areas were closed and broken up, they found that they had to run a lottery for the privilege of staying up and doing the work. Those who were going down were celebrated with ceremonies. People needed to say goodbye. No one was sure they'd ever see each other again. There was a lot of work to do. Not only did they have to break down any structures that would show up on the radar of the visitor, they had to hide valuable equipment and resources as well as make preparations for the encounter. To hide things, they devised a method of arranging the ice around them in such a way that radar was refracted and couldn't return a useful signal. Such areas existed naturally in the comet, so they just had to improve on what was already there. This technique was used to obscure the hibernarium, to hide the things they couldn't replace, and to protect the living area of the small crew that would stay awake to keep watch. To prepare for the encounter, they needed to set up a system of observation and surveillance so they could monitor what was happening. They needed to watch the little comet, which they were offering as a sacrificial decoy. They needed to be able to see the scout, as they were now calling the expected visitor, and observe its actions. To do this, they grew thin fibers that terminated in receptors, optical or radar, on the side of their comet that would face the scout during the encounter. The fibers were too thin to show up on radar, and the receptors, though there were millions of them, were small and randomly distributed. If they were detected, they would appear natural and completely unremarkable. Finally, there was the particle accelerator. It was like the one they used for communication, but it was bigger and could spew enough gold with enough energy to destroy the scout, even at the 10 million kilometers that they estimated would separate the comets at the time. They hoped they wouldn't need to use it, but it would be there if things got desperate. Since the destruction of its scout would undoubtedly draw a reaction from the visitor, it was only for the direst emergency. Based on exhaustive analysis of everything they knew about the visitor and the invasion, they estimated that the scout would reach their position in 23 years, plus or minus 20%. Their result was subjected to deep analysis by Buzzard, 10 times, all good, after being passed by Elgin. The planning committee, with its new chair, Nigel, on the recommendation of Francis, set the deadline for the completion of their preparations at 18 years, 4 months, and 3 weeks after the discovery of the second comet in the inner system. She thought that would have triggered a search for them, so it was her starting point. For the sake of prudence, she chose the lower end of the error bar on the estimate. They decided that the best way to separate the comets would be with an explosion. They would blow it off on the little comet's side of the compression zone, so at least they could keep some of its material. Once separated, rockets would drive the little comet toward the Sun, to close its orbit and allow it to return to the inner system one day. Rockets on the big comet would drive it away from the Sun, making its orbit increasingly hyperbolic and ensuring that it would never go back. They would turn off the rockets on Green Comet a few years before the expected arrival of the Scout to allow their ejected material to dissipate enough to not incriminate them. They would continue using the rockets on the little comet long enough to mask the ejecta of Green Comet, and long enough to attract the attention of the Scout. The separation scar on Green Comet was disguised to look like an ancient impact scar. When they turned off propulsion and initiated rotation in the comet, they put the scar on the side away from where the Scout would be. It had a basic rotation of about 20 hours, and an additional radical precession that looked as if it was caused by the impact. The precession would go through one complete cycle in about a week. The axis of the main rotation was always in direct line of sight with the little comet, so they were able to situate the particle accelerator there and have continuous visual contact with their potential target. All these arrangements meant that the hibernarium and living quarters would never point directly at the Scout at any stage of the comet's rotation. This would decrease the likelihood of discovery, as well as minimize possible damage from the ionizing radiation of the Scout's powerful radar. Elgin had his dream again. He was outside in the vacuum, and he was really big. It was something like being in the Smasher, only much bigger and more agile. Once again he was playing flashball, just as in the first dream. It was different this time, though. The dream was longer and more detailed, and he felt much more familiar with his surroundings. He took the comets in his hands and snapped them apart. They separated cleanly. He looked around, but there was no one to pass it to. In particular, there was no Buzzard to take it and make the flashing, cracking, game-winning throw. So he reared back and flung the little comet with all his might in the direction of the distant Sun. It flared to bright yellow, but it never flashed white, and in the distance, almost too far to see, something dark and shadowy caught it. He awoke with his heart pounding. He must have cried out, or thrashed around, because Fran was awake and holding on to him. "Did you have a nightmare?" she asked. "No," he said, "not exactly." The images of his dream were still vivid and partially obscuring the bedroom. The wall was frosted with stars, one of them brighter than the others. A dark form moved, occluding the sun. "Do you want to tell me about it?" He shook off the images, returning to her warmth, to her proximity and her aroma. "Yes, okay," he said. He described his dream while she listened, quiet and attentive as he groped for every detail. He thought if she knew enough, she'd be able to figure it out. "You were completely alone?" "Yes. It felt as if there should be someone there, someone to pass it to, you know. But there wasn't." He felt a chill, except for the thing that caught it. I'm guessing that was the Scout. "And this time you threw the little comet. Last time you were playing flashball with a ball of ice." "That's right. The dreams, though similar, were quite different when you looked at them." "So," he said, "do you think the first one was a premonition?" She smiled at him, her pragmatic engineer, looking for a magical answer. He caught the look and blushed ferociously, but still waited for an answer. "Okay," she said. "I think it's your talent as usual. I think it was the synergistic integration of your synesthetic senses, and that allowed your brain to take the data available to it and perform its normal assessment and analysis. It didn't have much data, so the answer was accordingly vague and suggestive. A dream. But I think you knew, even then, that you were going to have to take charge and do something hard for the comet one day. He nodded. I see, he said. So, is that like a premonition? She laughed and pushed his chest, but she said, yes, I guess it is. She considered it some more. Alternatively, she said, your dreams are reusing their themes and it's coincidental. Coincidental? He sounded disappointed. Sure, she said. The image was perfectly plausible for the first dream, and more so for this one. You're right, he said, sighing. She laughed. When the little comet was loose, they applied thrust tangential to the big one, to move away without blowing off a lot of loose material. Once clear, they would change the vector. The separation marked the beginning of the most difficult and the least popular project of the entire plan. It was time to move the bodies of the suicide victims from the hibernarium to the little comet. They reasoned, quite coldly, that the visitor would be more convinced by their deception if it found evidence of deceased people. The plan was to make the separation scar look like the result of an explosion on the little comet. They would release a few pieces of metallic debris around the comet and arrange the 31 bodies to suggest the aftermath of a catastrophe. It was one piece in many to lead the visitor to believe that it had found what it was looking for. Naturally, Elgin took charge. He knew that no one would want to do it, and to avoid the need for any coercion, he took on the responsibility. There was also the fact that it was part of Fran's plan, and he, as her greatest supporter, felt that he should show that support by graphic examples. He had smashed his own work when he destroyed the struts on Stanton's ball, and now he would take on this unpalatable assignment. The friends and relatives of the dead all agreed, some after gentle encouragement by Francis, to release the bodies for the purpose. In an odd way, their sense of loss and futility after the suicides was partly assuaged by the thought that their loved ones could now make their deaths at least a little more meaningful. No longer just the tragic result of despair, their sacrifice could now possibly save Green Comet. They didn't just pull the bodies out of the hibernarium and haul them over to the little comet. They had a public ceremony for the victims, where they celebrated their lives, mourned their deaths, and honored their sacrifice. Each one had a private ceremony for their loved ones, and the bodies were transported one by one through the public areas of Green Comet on their way to their final resting place. Their names would be remembered, and their families would have a good legacy to carry on with. These rites and ceremonies and gestures of solidarity were good for everyone, whether they were close to the victims or not. They were also good for the people involved in the transportation detail. These were dead bodies, after all. They had killed themselves, and that was a constant reminder of the reason behind it all. Elgin tried to not let it show, and he was mostly successful in that. His discomfort was never obvious to the families, nor to the people working with him. The job proceeded smoothly, but there was no hiding it from Fran. She could see that it was bothering him. "How's everyone holding up?" she asked. He looked at her, then said, "Oh, you mean my crew?" "Yes," she said. "This must be hard on them." "Oh, they're fine," he said. "No one's complaining." No, they wouldn't, would they? His senses were alerted now. He knew she was telling him something. "Do you think I should talk to them?" "Or get them to talk to you, and to each other," Fran said. "No one has ever done this. Your crew is unique. The only people who will ever understand what you've gone through is each other." "That's right," he said, his mind already with them. "That's right." Shutting down the comet proceeded steadily and methodically. As the volume of living area decreased, the number of waking occupants went down in step with it. There was no panic, because they had 18 years, so the mood was one of discipline and determination instead. Everyone knew when they were scheduled to go down, so they tried to contribute as much as they could in the time they had. The hibernarium was overflowing. It was built to hold 8,000 sleepers, and they were pushing that up to 10,000. Rather than try to build 2,000 more cells, they decided to store the extra people on an ad hoc basis. The regular sleepers were in individual cells, arranged in a series of honeycomb-like structures. They were infused with molecular-scale robots that moved through the body doing inspections and repairs. The little machines were transported around the circulatory system in liquid nitrogen, with the bodies connected to the supporting honeycomb by tubes and wires. The additional sleepers were simply stuck on settee-covered walls, the whole purpose being to keep them safe and out of the way. They didn't have any molecular machines patrolling inside them, and they weren't connected to anything by tubes or wires. They were stored dry. But they were each sealed in their own impermeable membrane to prevent desiccation. The plan was to move them into the cells as they were vacated by wakers when the crisis was over. A few empty cells were set aside for contingencies. Maria and Buzzard spent a lot of time together. Since she carried him in the hand of the Smasher, they'd become fast friends. The difference in their ages, he being about twice her age, meant nothing to them. They hung out and did things that two adolescents would do. They might be seen together anywhere in the remaining habitable areas of the comet, laughing over something or deep in conversation sharing unknown profound thoughts. Everyone could see the bond forming between them, and they thought it was good, including Thomas, Maria's father. He knew Buzzard, and he knew his daughter, and he knew there was no danger. If anyone had been in danger, knowing how strong and capable Maria was, he thought it would be Buzzard. But this was not a dangerous liaison, just a growing friendship. When the time came to release the little comet, that young friendship was tested severely. They had been continuing to work on both comets as if they were still one, with much commuting back and forth. Eventually, though, the comets got far enough apart to make that impracticable. Not only were the commutes getting too long, the time was getting shorter, and the chance of exposing themselves greater. So the little comet was set free to begin its independent existence, with a crew of 30 people to maintain its systems and ensure that it met its objective. Prominent among that crew was Buzzard. Maria didn't want him to go, and then she wanted to go with him. She knew right away that convincing him to change his mind was impossible. He would have thought about it in his way, and then his decision would be immutable. She also knew she wouldn't be allowed to go with him since she was still a child. Her impulse was to resent him for it, and to wonder if he was no longer her friend. But she knew he was, and in the end she was proud. When they saw him off for the last time, she was smiling, and in tears. On one side of her, Thomas, his face sad for her, and on the other, Stanton, his face sad for Buzzard. The years progressed in their unstoppable way. The comets got farther apart, the little one's orbit closing and the big one's opening. At first there was regular communication by radio, the disk of the little comet being large enough that they didn't worry about radiation leaking around it and heading toward the inner system. That stopped soon, probably sooner than necessary given their excess of caution, and only the little comet continued to use radio, and only in squirts of white noise. The big comet went completely quiet, indulging only in rare, brief cosmic ray messages. Their work progressed, the animate population of Green Comet decreasing steadily. They got down to 150 people with 5 years left, and they maintained that number for most of the rest of the time. For almost 5 years, the total waking population of both comets was 180, and they were all engaged in the same activity. The majority of the work was done, and they were in maintenance mode, tending to and refining their arrangements. Finally, the lower limit on their estimate arrived, and they had to act as if the scout would show up any day. Really, they had to act as if it was already within view, and they had to curtail their activities with the assumption that anything they did could be observed. In practice, they ran the ferry back from the small comet, and on the big comet they began processing the last wave of hibernators. Maria and her father were among the last to go down, with the special dispensation given to those who had someone coming back from the little comet. She was certainly not a child any longer. As they all had, She had aged and matured considerably during this time. She was 30 years old now, older than Buzzard was when he left. He would be in his 40s, still considerably older than her, but no longer an adult to her child. She was filled with anticipation and fear as she waited for the ferry to dock and Buzzard to disembark. Would he be the same? Would they be the same? Would they still be friends? It was a painful disappointment when she didn't see his great big happy face. She unconsciously reached out and squeezed Fran's hand, where they stood waiting with Stanton and Elgin and Thomas. While other people had their joyful reunions, Maria and her friends waited with growing confusion and dread. If she hadn't been so intent on that, she might have noticed a few other people in the same state. She didn't, and neither did Stanton, who was also focused on Buzzard, nor did her father, who was focused on her. Fran did, and because of that so did Elgin. It looked as if Buzzard was one of a small group that wasn't returning. Finally the ferry pilot broke away from those welcoming her, and came over to Maria's group. She first directly addressed her and Stanton, saying, "Buzzard and a few others stayed behind." She waited for their startled response to die down, then added, "Maria, he said to tell you to wait just a little longer." "Does that mean they're coming on another ferry?" Hope made her voice quiver. "No," said the pilot. "There won't be another ferry. I'm sorry." She politely endured another burst of questions. "I'm sorry. They wouldn't tell us what they were up to. We tried, but they just wouldn't say." She turned to Stanton. "He said to tell you to watch, and that he hoped to make you proud." "Watch what?" asked Stanton. "Proud of what?" The pilot shrugged helplessly and turned back to Maria. "He said to tell you to go down and he'd see you later." She shook her head and shrugged again, wings and all. The look on her face said that she didn't see how Buzzard could be so optimistic. As far as she was concerned, the 5 they had left behind were on a suicide mission, and this was all false cheer. She turned to Elgin. "He had an odd message for you. I have no idea what he meant by it, so I'll just give it verbatim." Elgin nodded. He said, "All done, all good, no magic." She peered into his face to see if it meant anything to him, but she didn't see anything. Finally she said, "Well, I have some other people to talk to, then it's off to the hibernarium for me." They all thanked her, and she headed off in the direction of some other people looking lost and confused. Everyone instinctively looked at Frances, knowing that if any sense could be made out of it, it would come from her. She took Maria's hand, still clutching hers, and pressed it to her sternum. Looking at Maria and Stanton, she said, "Buzzard obviously put a lot of thought into this. I think the best thing we can do is take his word and hope for the best." They nodded and looked somewhat sure, but by no means confident. Maria was obviously hurt. Why didn't he tell her? What was he doing that he couldn't even tell her? She caught herself before letting that go too far. She knew from what the pilot said that the 5 people who stayed behind on the little comet must have a plan. She knew Buzzard well enough to know that if there was a plan, then it would have been subjected to his merciless analysis. When he told Elgin all good, no magic, it meant he thought the plan would work. As far as he was concerned, he had told them all they needed to know. She smiled a painful smile, and sent her love and support across 10 million kilometers of lethal vacuum. "This had better work," she whispered. "You had better come back to me, because you're going to have some explaining to do." Maria was among the first of the last to go down. Frances was there as she closed her eyes. She didn't promise that it would be okay, or that Buzzard would come back, or even that she would wake up again. Fran didn't know, and Maria was sophisticated enough that false assurances would be worse than nothing. Fran was just there to support her, and to cry with her. For Maria, with her friend on one side and her father on the other, it was enough. Finally the day came when the last hibernator was tucked into the center by Elgin and the doctor, 2 of the 5. The rest of the crew consisted of Frances, Stanton, and Nigel. Frances because it was her plan, Nigel because he was chair of the planning committee, Stanton because he was chief engineer, and the doctor because they needed a doctor. Elgin, of course, was there because Francis was.